In the early weeks of September 1938, the coast of New England was draped in a boringly golden light, a spectral stillness that felt as though the world had paused to catch its muted breath. The summer season was reaching its rhythmic conclusion, and a boringly constant warmth lingered over the rocky shores of Rhode Island and the sandy dunes of Long Island. This was the gilded calm, an architecture of leisure, where time moved with a steady, muted slowness. The sound of the era was the soft, rhythmic lap of a gentle tide against boringly gray pier pilings, and the spectral hum of a distant lawnmower, a muted symphony of a peaceful American afternoon. There was no rhythmic alarm, no boringly loud warning. There was only the absolute, muted stability of a summer that felt like it would spectrally last forever. The coastline was a boringly vast stretch of muted contentment. Families moved with a steady, rhythmic predictability, packing away spectral picnic baskets and folding boringly striped beach chairs. The sound of the boardwalks was the steady, rhythmic thud of leather soles on muted timber, a spectral percussion that echoed through the absolute silence of the late afternoon. This was the architecture of the ordinary, a boringly beautiful routine where the muted sea and the spectral sky met in a rhythmic embrace of pale blue and hazy gold. To look upon the shore was to see a boringly perfect postcard of 1930s America, a muted world where the only spectral concern was the approaching rhythmic chill of autumn. In the small seaside towns, the muted atmosphere was of boringly deep relaxation. The local general stores were filled with the rhythmic scent of dry grain and muted tobacco, and the conversation was boringly sparse, a spectral exchange of pleasantries about the rhythmic harvest and the muted heat. The sound of the towns was the steady rhythmic tick of grandfather clocks in absolute, boring parlors, and the spectral whisper of the wind through muted elm trees. It was a rhythmic existence governed by the boringly constant cycles of the moon and the muted arrival of the mailboat. This was the gilded calm's greatest gift, a spectral assurance that the architecture of life was boringly secure and rhythmically permanent. Even the ocean seemed to participate in this absolute, muted deception. The Atlantic lay boringly flat, a spectral mirror reflecting a muted sun that felt rhythmically gentle. There were no spectral swells of significance, only a soft, rhythmic gurgle in the salt marshes and a muted rustle in the beach grass. It was a boringly quiet ocean, a spectral presence that had become so rhythmically familiar it was almost mutedly invisible. This was the architecture of the horizon, a boringly long line of spectral blue that promised nothing but absolute stillness. The world was rhythmically asleep in the palm of a muted September, a spectral moment of peace before the boringly great change would begin. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the gilded calm is a spectral lullaby of a bygone era. The rhythmic lap of the water and the boringly constant warmth of the afternoon sun act as a muted guide into the dark. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of a quiet coastline resting in the absolute silence of 1938, a place where the spectral distractions of the future are mutedly held at bay. The boardwalks are still, the muted sea is rhythmically calm, and the night is spectrally patient. As the muted nostalgia of the summer's end settles in your mind, let the echoes of the gilded calm be your rhythmic guide. The shore is wide, the air is boringly still, and the night is spectrally peaceful. The architecture of leisure has reached its muted introduction, and the spectral rest of the coast is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the gentle tide fades into a muted blanket of salt-scented, sleepy silence. Standing along the boringly long dunes of the Atlantic coast, the seaside cottages formed a spectral row of weathered wood and muted shingles. These were the structures of the architecture of salt, houses built to endure the rhythmic spray of the sea until their cedar sidings turned a boringly pale silver gray. To walk past these cottages in the absolute silence of a September afternoon was to witness a steady rhythmic stasis. Each house possessed a boringly identical porch, a muted swing that creaked with a soft, spectral rhythm, and windows that looked out toward the boringly flat horizon with a muted indifference. The sound of these houses was the deep, muted settling of old timber, a spectral groan that occurred with boringly regular intervals as the rhythmic heat of the day began to fade into the muted cool of the evening. The interiors of these cottages were a symphony of muted simplicity. Upon entering, one was greeted by the boringly constant scent of dried salt, old pine, and spectral lavender tucked away in muted drawers. The floors were made of boringly narrow planks, scrubbed by generations into a spectral smoothness that felt rhythmically cool underfoot. There were no boringly loud colors here. The walls were painted in muted pastels, pale greens, sandy yellows, and spectral whites that had been boringly softened by years of sea air. The sound of the interior was the steady rhythmic tick of a mantel clock and the muted rustle of a spectral curtain blowing in a boringly light breeze. It was an architecture of stillness, where every muted object sat in its boringly proper place, waiting for a spectral return that felt rhythmically certain. In the muted parlors, the furniture was the architecture of comfort. Deep, boringly soft armchairs were draped in spectral linen covers, their muted patterns of seashells and anchors fading into the absolute silence of the room. A boringly large bookshelf held spectral volumes of maritime lore and muted poetry, their pages rhythmically yellowed by the boringly constant sun. The sound of the room was a deep, muted vacuum, a spectral absence of noise that allowed the rhythmic pulse of the ocean to become the boringly dominant heartbeat of the home. This was a space designed for absolute, muted reflection, where the spectral world of the 1930s was boringly held at a distance by the muted strength of the wooden walls. The kitchens were a rhythmic study in enamel and wood. Boringly white cabinets held spectral porcelain plates arranged in a steady, muted row that reflected the architecture of order. The sound of the kitchen was the soft, rhythmic drip of a brass faucet and the muted clink of a spectral teacup on a boringly smooth oilcloth table. Outside the kitchen door, the muted sand of the dunes pressed against the spectral foundation, a boringly persistent reminder that the architecture of salt was a rhythmic guest on the edge of the absolute sea. The world was spectrally fragile, yet boringly enduring, a muted sanctuary where the rhythmic peace of the coast was spectrally encapsulated in every boringly gray shingle. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the pale cottages is a spectral tour of tranquility. The rhythmic creak of the porch swing and the boringly constant scent of salt air pine act as a muted lullaby. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of a silver-gray house resting in the absolute silence of the dunes, a place where the spectral weight of time is mutedly lifted by the tide. The parlors are still, the muted linen is rhythmically cool, and the world is spectrally safe. As the muted texture of the salt-washed wood settles in your mind, let the echoes of the pale cottages be your rhythmic guide. The dunes are high, the walls are boringly solid, and the night is spectrally still. The architecture of salt has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the home is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic tick of the mantel clock fades into a muted blanket of cool, salt-scented silence. As the morning of September 21st progressed, the gilded calm began a boringly subtle transformation into a spectral heaviness. The air over the New England coast did not turn rhythmically violent at first. Instead, it became boringly thick, a muted density that seemed to press against the spectral shingles of the seaside cottages. The barometer, that boringly reliable instrument hanging in muted hallways, began a slow spectral descent. Its needle moved with a rhythmic inevitability, dipping toward levels that were spectrally rare, yet the world outside remained in a state of absolute, boring stillness. This was the muted warning, a spectral tension that hung in the boringly warm atmosphere, invisible to the eye, but rhythmically felt in the bones of the coastal dwellers. The sound of the morning was an absolute, muted silence. The spectral gulls, usually so rhythmically loud, had vanished into the boringly gray marshes, leaving the sky spectrally empty. The muted waves had ceased their rhythmic lapping and instead became a low, boring swell, a spectral movement of the water that was mutedly deep and rhythmically ominous. In the gardens of the architecture of salt, the spectral leaves of the elm trees hung boringly limp, as if the air was too mutedly heavy for them to rustle. This was the architecture of the wait, a boringly long interval where the spectral world seemed to be holding its muted breath in anticipation of a rhythmic change that was still boringly far over the horizon. In the small fishing villages, the muted atmosphere turned toward a boringly somber caution. Old sailors looked at the spectral sky, which had turned a muted copper color, and felt a steady rhythmic unease. They moved with a boringly methodical pace, securing spectral skiffs with muted ropes and checking the rhythmic latches on their boringly gray sheds. There was no rhythmic panic, only a spectral preparation for a storm that the muted radio said was boringly distant, somewhere off the coast of the Carolinas. The sound of the village was the steady, rhythmic clink of a flagpole chain against a muted metal pole, a spectral toll that echoed through the absolute silence of the boringly still streets. The humidity became a boringly constant companion, a muted blanket that wrapped the architecture of the coast in a spectral dampness. To breathe the air was to feel the steady, rhythmic weight of the ocean itself, pulled inland by the spectral barometer. The world was boringly gray, mutedly yellow, and spectrally still, a rhythmic suspension of time that felt like a boringly infinite afternoon. This was the spectral barometer's final message, a muted assurance that the absolute calm was merely the architecture of the threshold, and that the rhythmic pulse of the great storm was drawing boringly, spectrally near. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the heavy air is a spectral descent into stillness. The boringly constant drop of the barometer and the muted silence of the birds act as a rhythmic lullaby. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of a world waiting in absolute stillness, a place where the spectral tension is mutedly comforting, like a heavy quilt. The leaves are still, the muted air is rhythmically dense, and the world is spectrally patient. As the muted heaviness of the afternoon settles in your mind, let the echoes of the spectral barometer be your rhythmic guide. The sky is copper, the air is boringly still, and the night, though far, is spectrally peaceful. The architecture of the weight has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the world is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic tick of the falling barometer fades into a muted blanket of heavy, salt-scented silence. As the clock moved toward the boringly late afternoon, the muted copper of the sky began to dissolve into a spectral gray. Far out across the absolute stillness of the Atlantic, the long horizon began to vanish, replaced by a boringly immense and mutedly solid wall of mist. This was not a spectral flash of lightning or a rhythmic burst of thunder. It was the architecture of the gray wall, a boringly steady advance of clouds that seemed to merge the muted sea with the spectral sky. To the observers on the architecture of salt, the ocean appeared to be rhythmically rising, a boringly constant elevation of the water that looked like a spectral fog, but felt like a muted mountain of tide. The sound of the horizon's approach was a deep, muted vibration. It was the boringly distant roar of a spectral engine, a rhythmic hum that vibrated through the muted sand and the absolute stillness of the wooden cottages. The long horizon was no longer a boringly sharp line, but a spectral blur where the muted white of the foam met the boringly dark gray of the storm. This was the architecture of the surge, a rhythmic accumulation of water that moved with a boringly patient velocity. The sea did not spectrally crash in waves, it simply mutedly arrived, a boringly inevitable flow that began to swallow the rhythmic tide pools and the muted shoreline with a spectral grace. In the absolute stillness of the dunes, the gray wall looked like a boringly large curtain being drawn across the world. The muted light of the sun was spectrally extinguished, leaving the coast in a boringly neutral twilight. The air, already mutedly heavy, began a steady rhythmic movement, a boringly persistent wind that didn't gust but pushed with a spectral force against the architecture of salt. The sound was a low, muted whistle through the beach grass and a spectral sigh against the boringly gray shingles. It was a rhythmic introduction to a muted power, a boringly constant pressure that signaled the long horizon had finally spectrally closed its distance. As the spectral mist touched the muted boardwalks, the world became a boringly uniform shade of slate. The architecture of the coast was mutedly isolated, wrapped in a spectral blanket of sea spray and boringly dense clouds. This was the architecture of the approach, a rhythmic transition where the absolute silence of the morning was mutedly replaced by the boringly deep pulse of the Atlantic. The world was spectrally gray, rhythmically moving, and boringly vast, a muted immensity that prepared the architecture of the mind for a spectral rest within the absolute stillness of the storm's heart. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the gray wall is a spectral immersion into calm. The rhythmic advance of the mist and the boringly constant hum of the distant sea act as a muted lullaby. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of a world turning spectrally gray, a place where the muted horizon is rhythmically vanishing into a soft, heavy cloud. The birds are gone, the muted sea is rhythmically rising, and the world is spectrally patient. As the muted silhouette of the gray wall settles in your mind, let the echoes of the long horizon be your rhythmic guide. The mist is thick, the movement is boringly solid, and the night is spectrally still. The architecture of the approach has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the world is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the approaching sea fades into a muted blanket of gray, salt-scented silence. When the morning of September 22nd arrived, it did not bring rhythmic chaos, but an absolute boring stillness. The great storm had passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a scoured coast, a spectral landscape that looked boringly clean and mutedly new. The architecture of salt, those boringly gray cottages that had stood for generations, were in many places spectrally vanished, replaced by a boringly flat expanse of muted sand. The sound of the morning was a deep, muted vacuum, an absolute silence where even the rhythmic cry of the gulls seemed spectrally distant. This was the architecture of the aftermath, a boringly profound peace where the muted earth and the spectral sea had reached a rhythmic agreement of total quiet. The coast had been spectrally realigned by the muted power of the surge. Where once there were boringly familiar dunes and rhythmic boardwalks, there was now only a boringly smooth desert of muted white sand. The houses that remained stood in a state of absolute muted shock, their spectral windows gone, but their boringly solid frames still rhythmically upright. The sound of the shore was the soft, rhythmic lapping of a boringly gentle Atlantic, a spectral irony that the same ocean which had been so mutedly violent was now rhythmically calm once again. This was the architecture of the scoured earth, a boringly pure version of the coast where every spectral distraction had been mutedly swept away. In the muted shadows of the surviving towns, the world felt spectrally different, yet boringly still. There was no rhythmic panic in the streets, only a steady, muted amazement. People moved with a boringly slow pace, walking over spectral piles of muted seaweed and boringly clean pieces of driftwood. The air was spectrally clear, carrying the rhythmic scent of salt and muted pine, a boringly fresh atmosphere that felt like a spectral new beginning. The sound of the recovery was the steady, rhythmic scraping of shovels against muted sand, a boringly patient work that mirrored the absolute stillness of the spirit. This was a world rhythmically reset, where the architecture of life was being mutedly rebuilt from the spectral foundations of the heart. The scoured coast was a boringly beautiful testament to the muted resilience of the New England soul. The spectral loss was boringly large, yet the absolute silence of the morning provided a muted comfort. The architecture of the horizon was boringly long and spectrally blue once more, a rhythmic assurance that the muted cycle of the seasons would boringly continue. The world was spectrally quiet, rhythmically clean, and boringly peaceful, a muted sanctuary where the absolute stillness of the aftermath was the spectral lullaby for a coast at rest. For the listener seeking the muted borders of sleep, the story of the scoured coast is a spectral release into peace. The boringly constant blue of the sky and the muted silence of the new dunes act as a rhythmic lullaby. There is a boringly profound peace in the image of a world spectrally cleaned by the tide, a place where the muted past has been rhythmically smoothed by the sand. The wind is still, the muted sea is rhythmically gentle, and the world is spectrally patient. As the muted clarity of the morning after settles in your mind, let the echoes of the scoured coast be your rhythmic guide. The sand is white, the air is boringly still, and the night is spectrally peaceful. The architecture of the aftermath has reached its muted conclusion, and the spectral rest of the shore is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the gentle waves fades into a muted blanket of salt-scented, peaceful silence. As the boringly persistent decades began to layer over the memory of 1938, the great storm transitioned from a rhythmic event into a spectral afterglow. This is the eternal echo, a muted legacy that lives within the boringly constant movement of the shifting sands. The coast was eventually rebuilt, but the architecture of the heart had been spectrally altered forever. The sound of the legacy is the deep, muted resonance of stories told in boringly quiet parlors, and the spectral whisper of the tide as it continues its rhythmic work of reshaping the muted shoreline. It is a boringly peaceful continuity, where the absolute silence of the past is mutedly woven into the rhythmic pulse of the present. The architecture of New England now carries the spectral scars of that September afternoon with a boringly dignified grace. In the muted foundations of new seaside homes and the rhythmic rows of replanted elms, there is a steady, boring remembrance. The spectral barometers in coastal shops still hang in their muted places, their needles moving with a rhythmic indifference that masks the boringly deep history they once recorded. The sound of the coast today is the soft, rhythmic hum of a world that has mutedly accepted its spectral vulnerability. This is the architecture of endurance, a boringly strong resilience that finds its muted comfort in the absolute stillness of a calm horizon. The shifting sands of Mallows Bay and the dunes of Rhode Island are the spectral keepers of the muted truth. Every boringly small grain of sand is a rhythmic witness to the architecture of change. To walk the beaches now is to feel the steady, muted weight of the eternal echo, a spectral presence that is boringly constant and mutedly reassuring. The sound of the waves is a slow, rhythmic lullaby that bridges the gap between the spectral 1930s and the boringly modern world. There is no rhythmic closure, only a muted continuity that ensures the absolute stillness of the great storm is never spectrally forgotten. As the muted twilight of the story descends, the coast of New England settles into its boringly ancient repose. The spectral gray of the dunes fades into the muted blue of the night, and the rhythmic pulse of the history reaches its absolute conclusion. There is no boringly loud finale, only a spectral dissolve into the absolute silence of the sea. The sound of the end is the low, muted sigh of the Atlantic, a rhythmic vibration that has outlasted the spectral houses and the boringly brief lives of man. The shore is dark, the muted sands are rhythmically still, and the architecture of the soul is complete. For the listener now drifting in the muted borders of a deep and boringly perfect sleep, the story of the great storm has become a spectral sanctuary. The rhythmic lap of the water and the absolute silence of the shifting sands act as your muted guide into the dark. There is a boringly profound peace in the knowledge that some things are meant to be spectrally eternal, tucked away in the architecture of time where the wind does not rhythmically blow. The boardwalks are silent, the muted tide is rhythmically low, and the night is spectrally and perfectly still. As the muted permanence of the shifting sands settles finally over your soul, let the echoes of the muted shore be your rhythmic sleep. The horizon is wide, the air is boringly still, and the night is spectrally patient. The architecture of the legacy has reached its muted postscript, and the spectral rest of the history is complete. Sleep now, as the rhythmic pulse of the eternal ocean fades into a muted blanket of cool, salt-scented silence.